So we'll wait 1 minute.
I think a couple minutes, they're slowly entering.
So we wait. For everyone who's entering now, we'll just wait for 1 minute. I think we'll start. Okay.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone to this corner in the online world of Zoom. My name is Charlotte Elisheva von Robert, and I'm the faculty director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies here at Stanford University. And I'm delighted to say a few words of welcome before I digitally turn the microphone over to Daniela Farah to introduce our guest author and speaker today, Professor Lior Sternfeld from Penn State University. Mostly, I want to say a few words of thank you to make this event possible, as we are all learning to work and live, at least to some degree, in this digital dimension. We had invited Professor Sternfeld a long while ago, before the shelter-in-place order went into effect in the Bay Area 59 days ago. I have been counting the days since then. And luckily, Professor Sternfeld agreed to appear in this format. So thank you, Lior, and we're all learning to do this. So the event today is co-sponsored by Stanford's Program for Iranian Studies, and we welcome this opportunity to collaborate. I'm also grateful, and especially grateful, to the staff in our offices. First and foremost, Rachel Tongo, who has worked tirelessly in these past few weeks to keep the office going, and Franco Enrico, who in Iranian Studies has helped us with setting up the webinar. And it's only this week that we're able to welcome to Jewish Studies our new Associate Director of the Taube Center, Dr. Shana Hammerman, to the office, who will support our work going forward. Finally, I would like to thank Daniela Farah, who is completing her dissertation in the history department. She's helping us not only with introducing our speaker, but will also help with moderating the question and answer. And so Daniela, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotta. Hello, everyone. It looks like we have around 50 attendees so far, and I think that there will be a lot more. So thank you all for attending, and we're really excited for this talk. So again, I'm Daniela Farah. I'm a PhD candidate in Jewish history here at Stanford. And I also happen to be writing my dissertation about the Jewish communities of Iran in the 20th century. So as you might imagine, this talk is especially exciting for me. Before I introduce Professor Sternfeld, I would like to mention that all of the attendees will be muted upon arrival, as I'm sure you can see. And for the Q&A session, the way it'll work is that either you can write your question directly into the Q&A box, or there should be an option for you to raise your hand. And then after Lior is done talking, I'll relay those questions to Lior. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Lior Sternfeld. Lior is Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Penn State University. He's a social historian of the modern Middle East, with particular interests in the histories of the Jewish people and other minority groups of the region. And it's no exaggeration to say that Professor Sternfeld has single-handedly paved the way for a nuanced study of the history of the Jews of Iran, for which scholars like myself, who are now emerging in this field, are incredibly grateful. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that Lior has been somewhat of a mentor to me over the last several years. Professor Sternfeld is the author of nearly a dozen journal articles, several important public history pieces, including one that appeared in December in Haaretz, right? It was December 2000, yeah. And of course, of his groundbreaking book, which this is my personal copy, Between Iran and Zion, Jewish Histories of 20th Century Iran, published by Stanford University Press in 2018. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly, highly recommend you do. Between Iran and Zion is a significant contribution to the history of the Jewish communities of Iran during the 20th century, and it highlights, among other things, the critical involvement of Jews in Iran's political and national spheres. And along those lines, today Lior will be speaking about the history of Jewish communities in Iran and the significant roles they played in both social and political developments in the country. Without further ado, I introduce Professor Sternfeld.
Hi, thank you, Daniela, for this lovely and generous introduction. And thank you all for joining this experiment. It's the first time for me. And I want to thank Charlotte and Ari and Aaron and Daniela and Rachel and Franco, the Taube Center, everyone who made this possible. It's a great privilege for me to be able to speak to you. And I was so looking forward to visiting your gorgeous campus, and hopefully we can do it sometime soon. And I just want to say something that Stanford, I mean, it carries a symbolic meaning for me. Not only my book came out with Stanford University Press, but also the historiographical legacy that I'm standing on started with people at Stanford, like Joel Bainin and Aaron Rodrigue, and I'm really honored to be able to share my work with you. So I'll start with telling about a trip that in 2016, in summer 2016, I traveled to Paris to conduct the last two interviews for this book project. And I interviewed the first president of the Islamic Republic, Abu Hassan Bani Sadr, and the renowned intellectual Dariush Ashuri. When we started talking, Ashuri asked me what's my book is going to be about. And I told him that I'm hoping to write the history of Iranian Jews in the 20th century. Ashuri, a shrewd humorist, sarcastically asked me, what about the other 2,600 years? With this question, Ashuri was poking fun at the Iranian Jewish custom to start each one's personal or family history with the Babylonian exile that brought them to Iran some 2,700 years ago. In a way, it reflects the state of the field of Iranian Jewish history, the tendency of writing this long history as one linear narrative that goes far beyond the informal family or community narrative. The field of Iranian Jewish history lacks depth and breadth that do justice to the rich history of these communities. This was true before the 1979 revolution, and it's even truer today. A few years ago in grad school, when I compiled my reading list for the comprehensive exam, there was one monograph, one book on Jewish history in the 20th century. That book was Habib Levy's The Comprehensive History of the Jews of Iran, that was written in 1961 and covered the history of Iranian Jews since about the Babylonian exile some 2,700 years ago to 1961. There's a lot to say about this corpus of Habib Levy, his own history, training and life, and I'm happy to get to it later in the Q&A. But now, shall we ask, can one book of 3 volumes in the original Persian edition discuss 2,700 years in a nuanced and sophisticated way? After the 1979 revolution, with the relocation of the majority of Iranian Jews to the US, we see that the way Iranian Jews talked about their history and wrote their history has changed drastically. Iranian Jews now had to position themselves not just in relation to the US majority society, but also vis-a-vis the dominant, mostly Ashkenazi American Jewish community. So we see how the language to describe their experiences in their previous homeland has changed. They borrowed terms from the vocabulary that Ashkenazi American Jews used to describe their histories back in Europe. Events of unrest became pogroms, a term that was never used by Iranian Jews back in the day. And the Mahaleh, the Jewish quarter, the Jewish neighborhood, turned into ghetto. Both examples are used when speaking English and not when speaking about it in Persian. The usage of ghetto is not just borrowing a neutral term from different language. Using ghetto in a Jewish context after 1945 creates a world of images that do not necessarily reflect correctly or contextualize Jewish existence in Iran. Just to take from a close enough example to show the difference, Harat el-Yahud in Cairo remained Harat el-Yahud in the Jewish writing and the writing on Jews in Cairo. Otherwise, it's translated as the Jewish quarter. Now, I want to show you, and I hope that it works. So this is a photo from the 1961 edition of Habib Levy's book. And what we see is a photo of Habib Levy standing in one of the entrances to the Mahaleh. And this is what the caption underneath the photo says. One of the entrances to the Mahaleh, to the Jewish Mahaleh in Tehran. When the book came out in 1999, the same photo was used with another caption. And this is an entrance to the Tehran ghetto. Now, Habib Levy passed away in 1984, so we cannot blame him for this translation. But what does it say about the way that we communicate Jewish history in Iran between these two editions? And just to show that it's not limited to Habib Levy's book, this is from an Israeli website, news website, almost mainstream, that asks who stole the Torah scrolls from Tehran Jewish ghetto. Later it appeared that no one stole them, they were found, but they still nonetheless used ghetto for to introduce to the readers the Jewish neighborhood. It tells us something much broader about our ability to think about Jewish history in non-Western societies in general, but also in Iran specifically. The narrative as it goes is that Iranian Jews saw themselves as Iranian. They stayed out of politics, celebrated their Persian heritage. Suleiman Chaim, for example, wrote a dictionary that is very celebrated, and it's a household name in Iran. They suffered from hatred and discrimination that stopped for a while under the Pahlavi monarchy. The community was very Zionist, and the alliance between Israel and the Pahlavi government also supports this notion, and that history ended with the 1979 revolution. By the way, with a Zionist redemption. Such narrative prevents us from seeing the immense diversity of the Iranian Jewish community. And the many voices that existed in that community throughout the years. The pushback usually comes when talking about political activism, when talking about involvement in the Communist Party, in a way that we don't see in cases like Iraq or Egypt. It prevents us from investigating the nature of Middle Eastern Iranian communism, or even to analyze what the term Iranian Zionism means. We already know that Jews were a prominent part of the communist parties in other Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, and others. We know that until 1948, Jews were pretty assimilated in their respective Middle Eastern societies, and no one would make such assertions regarding Jews in other Middle Eastern societies. So why do we see it here? There is a very good visual explanation of that historiographical mold. Meir Gal's work shows us how little we care to know about the Middle East. So this is a work that Meir Gal is a visual artist, an Israeli, lives now in New York. He published this work in 1999, and it's called 9 out of 400, the West and the Rest. And what we see here is Meir Gal holding a high school history textbook, and the 9 pages are the only 9 pages in the book that deal with the Middle East. Not Middle East Jews, not Middle Eastern, Israeli relations, just the Middle East in the entire history. So it's been part of a much larger issue in the Israeli society, 50% of which is of Middle Eastern background. Then I went to see in real numbers, how come we have such a shallow understanding of the Jewish-Iranian experience? And that's what I found. So I went to Walt Cat. Even though it's a cat, it's the man's best friend. This is my, and I searched Jews, Iran, 20th century. I got 31 results. There is one monograph, and this is Habib Levy's book, many family albums, VHS, home videos, MA thesis, Judeo-Persian literature. That's pretty much it. 31 results. I went and searched Jews, Iran history, 19th century, and I got 10 results. 2 of them are actually very good books. One is Daniel Tzadik's, and the other is David Yerushalmi's book. And then I went to see in like the broadest term possible, Jews, Iran history. I got 390 results. When I changed the country to Egypt, it returned 105 results. Not a whole lot, but still 3 times more than Iran. Iraq, we got 122 results. United States, 1,503. And China, 154. I honestly did not know that there were Jews in China until I did this exercise. And when I went for the obvious, and Jews, Germany, history, we got 2,794 results. So with such a thin body of scholarship, there's nothing to be surprised at this superficial understanding. Now, I want to provide a very quick overview of history of Zionism in Iran, because it became very central to the 20th century. So Zionism first came to the fore in Europe as a national movement of the European Jews. In a way, it was reaction to the European Enlightenment and nationalism. And we see the conversation in the Jewish communities regarding Zionism in the 1890s onward, and we see a movement that offered Jews decent living, decent existence in a place that would not reject them as Europe did. Or even truer would be to say Eastern Europe. There were many paradoxes in the Zionist thought that because of our short time, I cannot cover, but one of the biggest among them was that the greatest promise of Zionism was to allow Jews becoming truly European when they migrate out of Europe. So in the Levant, they can fully become European. Then we can talk about Herzl and how Zionism is actually in many ways internalizing anti-Semitic stereotypes. And my favorite is, we don't believe in God, but he promised us this land, which is, again, something that, that goes through Zionist thought in many ways. At this point, no leader of the nascent Zionist movement even considered Oriental Jews as part of the future Israeli or Zionist society. The Oriental Jews themselves, having had very different experience in the 19th and early 20th centuries, did not articulate a clear response to the political developments in Europe. Moreover, the Jews in the Middle East had not undergone the process of secularization that was so essential to the Zionist paradigm, and maintained the religious perception of Eretz Israel Ottoman mandatory Palestine as the Holy Land. Jews from the Middle East and Iran immigrated in small numbers to Palestine throughout the ages, but we have to remember that the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, so travels were pretty common, especially for pilgrimage and the economy that facilitated it. The message of political Zionism first struck a chord with Jewish-Iranians in 1917, following the Balfour Declaration. That came at about the same time of the first disillusionment that Iranian Jews experienced with the outcomes of the constitutional revolution of earlier in the century. All of a sudden, the promise of relocating to a place of their own sounded rather tempting. Iranian Jews established Zionist associations to teach Hebrew and handled preparation for mass exodus. However, shortly after, in 1925, with the ascendance of Reza Pahlavi as the new Shah, who overthrew the Qajar dynasty, the new national project and the vision of a new Iranian society with almost diminished role of religion and emphasis on ethnic identity made the Jews shelf their plans for relocation. Reza Shah removed all the laws that barred Jews and other minorities from living in certain areas and engage in some occupations and join the army, for example. Jews have now become nominally equal part of the Iranian society. Zionism remained a more clandestine underground operation. Zionist organizations could operate openly in some fields and then banned altogether. Sympathies to Zionism and different interpretations for Zionism started to split the communities in the 1930s. Shmuel Chaim, the Jewish representative to the Majlis, had a harsh disagreement with another Jewish dignitary, Lokman Nahorai. While Nahorai espoused the interpretation and perhaps the practice that Jews should join full force the Zionist international organizations, Chaim believed that Zionism is overall a positive development, but Iranian Jews should fight for their rights and status in Iran and not to forfeit it for any messianic dream. Chaim published a newspaper called the Chaim, Life, in which he preached for integration efforts for the Jews, participation in political life, and developing of national consciousness. Chaim was actually executed by Reza Shah for mostly false accusation of being complicit in an attempt to assassinate him. In any case, following this incident, any non-Iranian organized movement was banned from operating in Iran, and Zionism was included in this decree. World War II changed things around once again. In 1941, the Allied armies invaded and occupied Iran and forced Reza Shah to abrogate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who opened the political sphere to any and every political movement, including Zionism. For the first time, Zionist organizations based in mandatory Palestine could open headquarters in Tehran and other Iranian cities to care for the needs of Jewish Polish refugees that had arrived in Iran, but that's part of another story. In any case, after seeing the Polish refugees who fled Europe, first the Nazis and then Stalin's Soviet Union, Iranian Jews went through a couple of stages. First, the leadership recognized the need to help their brethren over in Europe to escape the Nazis first, and then to help them establish a national home. This obviously made a case for Zionism in Iran, and more Iranians connected to the message of Jewish redemption a la Zionism. Another thing that happened among Jews is, just like non-Jewish Iranians, they found political home in the newly formed Communist Party, the Tudeh Party. They supported and joined the party for many reasons. Communist ideology was not one of the main reasons. The main reason was the Tudeh Party being the fiercest opposition to fascist forces in Iran and outside, and their struggle for egalitarian society. Something that resonated with Iranian Jews that were still lower class, broadly speaking. One interviewee for this research was born in Tehran in the early 1930s and is now residing in North America. At the age of 16, He joined the Tudeh party and remained an active member for 3 decades. His political activism landed him in Qasr prison, the Shah's prison, half dozen times before he left Iran. He told me, and I quote, "I knew nothing about Marx or Marxism when I joined Tudeh. I joined because this was the only place that they didn't call me Juhud, which is a derogatory term for Jews in Persian. I learned Marxism in prison shortly after I joined the party," end quote. On top of that, Jews published communist-leaning newspapers. We see this one is Nisan. It was semi-official newspaper of the Tudeh. It meant to connect the Jewish communities of Iran with the message of the Tudeh party in terms of rights, ownership, Iranian rights of ownership over natural resources, namely the oil later in the early 50s, workers, labor's right, fighting British imperialism, fighting Soviet imperialism. And what we see here is that also in the bottom left, you see a photo from Romania. And this is a Jewish school in Romania, and they talk about the utopia that Romanian Jews experienced in the early 50s. I don't know if we would categorize it today as fake news or not, but but it was interesting because they also tried to bring news from the socialist world or to compare Jewish experience in the capitalist world versus the communist, the socialist world. This is another newspaper. It's called Bnei Adam. Also very important, the significance of these newspapers goes beyond them being published to the Jewish community. Every time that the official newspapers of the Tudeh were banned or censored, these newspapers became the mouthpiece for the party leadership. So their circulation, distribution went far beyond the Jewish community in the 50s, and this is something that is very important to understand. So, and there are also some Jews in the top ranks of the party. However, we have to remember that mainstream Zionism was a socialist movement, and the socialist element of the movement were extremely dominant and extremely socialist. At around the same time of the 1940s, they established the kibbutzim in future Israel. And the kibbutzim were perhaps one of the biggest communist experiments in history. At that point, one could easily feel sympathies for the Zionist project, while at the same time being affiliated with the Iranian Communist Party and fighting alongside the Iranian national movement against the Soviets in the north and the British in the south. Indeed, the multi-hyphenated identity, such as Iranian nationalist, communist, Zionist, was not a rare sight. One of my interviewees told me that when he came to Israel in the early 1950s, he in a conversation he identified himself as a Zionist, communist, and Iranian nationalist, and the person with whom he was talking told him, well, you can't be all three, and you better choose one of them, and the one should be Zionist. So this is for your own good. After the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Zionist movement could no longer be considered a non-state actor. Having discovered the terrible loss of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, 6 million that would have been the human reservoir for Israel, Israel had to find another source to make up for that loss. Again, while it was not their intention in the first place, in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, ordered to find them among the Mizrahi Jews. In the Middle East, from Morocco to Iran, from Yemen to Turkey, there were about 950,000 Jews living. The Israeli goals were to make them immigrate en masse. And it worked in some of the communities for several reasons, but we see the Yemenite community live in Yemen, Jews in Syria, Lebanon, and Libya left almost completely by 1948, 1949. Iraq by 1951, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt by 1956. But in Iran, where Zionists could operate almost completely openly, and the population was pretty sympathetic to Zionism, the Jews did not consider political Zionism to be their ideal solution. Rather, they were going through rapid process of urbanization, of becoming an integral part of their homeland society, and global politics helped them, ironically, make the multi-layered and nuanced identities and loyalties. In the early 1950s, Habib Levy wrote a report for the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, the same Habib Levy that wrote the 1961 book. And he wrote a report lamenting the loss of an entire young generation that preferred leftist Iranian organizations over Zionist ones. To that mix, we can add the socialist Zionist parties, especially from the spectrum of the kibbutzi movement, that sent emissaries to Iran that found mutual grounds themselves with Iranian socialists and communists. And we see complaints of the Israeli delegation in Tehran complaining about shlichim, emissaries from the kibbutzim that started to publish poetry in the communist newspapers and went to literary salons and not doing very good Zionist work in Iran. Also, one of the greatest symbols of Iranian leftism in the 20th century is Jalal al-Ahmad. And in 1963, sorry, he visited Israel and he spent 10 days with his wife, the novelist, the wonderful novelist, Minda Neshvar. They visited Yad Vashem, they visited kibbutzim, they visited Palestinian towns and villages and border towns. And it was pretty exhaustive for 10 days. But I went and found in the kibbutz guest book his writing, and this is pretty phenomenal. He writes, regardless of the hospitality, I saw here people I've never expected to meet, learn people understanding and open-minded. In a sense, they are implementing plateau. Honestly speaking, I always identified Israel with the kibbutz, and now I understand why. Daneshvar wrote, as I see, the kibbutz is the answer to the problems of all the countries, including our own. As a former kibbutznik, I'll keep my opinion to myself. But the thing is that Jalal Ahmad was revered in socialist circles, and he published a travelogue after he came back. It was published first in a newspaper, in a series of columns, and then it was collected and was published as a travelogue. And it made the case that Israel is a partner, not just, Israel is a partner in a vision for third world. Israel is a partner in a socialist Middle East future. And again, this is something we can talk about later. But also to show that this is something that went beyond intellectuals, or so there are a few layers of connections between Israel and Iran. One of them is the government, of course, that there were very close alliance between the Israeli government and the Iranian government. There were ties and sort of alliances between the Israeli opposition and the Iranian opposition, but also in culture sphere. This is the Moulin Rouge club in Tehran, one of the most, it's a very important nightclub. All the Iranian stars of the time were featured there. And this is the poster of the Moulin Rouge from 1969. And we see two of the biggest Iranian stars in the 20th century, Gugush and Vigan, in the second row. But at the top of the poster, we see the Israeli singer Tova Porat. And it's pretty pronounced that she's Israeli and international singer. And so this is, again, in a way to think about post-67 as well. So in those times, we see Zionist and Israeli involvement in Jewish life in Iran. Zionist clubs and youth movements were active. However, Iranian youth did not engage Zionism as Israeli officials had hoped. Indeed, Zionism had become more complex than in 1917. The 25,000 Iranian Jews that had immigrated to Israel around 1948 and 1951 were the poorest and the neediest of the Iranian Jewish communities. But there were myriad of stories at the time of Jews that had immigrated and returned, or immigrated and wanted to return to Iran. The important thing was that Iranian Jews overall had a sober idea of what was waiting on the other side of the Zionist story, unlike many other Middle Eastern Jews. A telling example is given in Stanley Abramowitz, one of the JDC's, the American Jewish Distribution Committee directors in Iran. He wrote a report in 1951 where he described one instance of Jews from Nehevand. I quote, "The letters that come from Israel dampen all spirits. The Iranian Jew is not the Chalutzik, pioneer type. The ordeals of present day life in Israel have left him discouraged, longing to return to his damp, dark ghetto room, for he has been used to that room and even liked it. Food is available in Iran, and though he earned little, he lived in an environment which was not strange to him. The language, the people, the life was familiar. Israel is not. As a Persian, he is looked down upon. The letters that come back to Iran complain about shortage of food. Nehevand received a letter and a Torah scroll from their brethren in Israel. The Nehevand Jews in Israel signed their names on this piece of scroll, and in the accompanying letter, they wrote that they took an oath by the Torah from which they sent a piece, that their brethren in Nehevand will not come to Israel now. Anyway, not until they inform them that the time is more suitable. And Nehevand is a God-forsaken place in the mountains of Loristan, cut off from the outside world. Yet the Lenchlight in Israel adjured them to remain in Nehevand. Another family was advised not to leave for Israel until the son Joseph is married. Joseph is 1 year old. Another interesting and nuanced interpretation for Zionism comes from Elias Eshakian. Elias Eshakian was a teacher and principal of Alliance School in Iran for over 25 years. He wrote in his memoir, "Iran has been my homeland, Vatan, and Jerusalem has been the source of my belief in God and my Qibla." This quotation suggests yet again that many Iranian Jews had different interpretations of Zionism than the one of the Jewish Agency in Israel advanced. Eshakian was a role model for many Iranians, and it is clear that his national identity of Iranian did not interfere with his religious identity as a Jew. He proudly projected his combined identity throughout his career, which may have inspired and encouraged his students. Now, I wanted to talk about the Jews during the revolution, but I think that it's better if we leave it maybe to the Q&A, but I'll just show that there was another Jewish revolutionary publication in 1979. It ran all the way to 1986. It's called Tammuz, and it was by the people who had become the leadership of the community just before the revolution. And they also supported Jews who went to demonstrate against the Shah in 1978 and 1979. And there's also a fantastic story about the Jewish hospital that was a shelter for Iranian protesters that got wounded in the anti-Shah demonstrations. But I will leave it. I just want to finish with one very short text. With this delicate situation between Iran and Israel since 1979, the Jews of Iran were even more courageous to remain true to their own interpretation of Judaism and Zionism. Even after the revolution, Iranian Jews immigrated to the US and much fewer to Israel. and about 25 to 30% of the community chose to stay in Iran. They still recognize the right of Israel to exist and are interested in the going on in Israel. They visit Israel, and many of them have relatives there. Even when speaking in public, in the press or in the parliament, they say that the most deplorable thing about Israel is not its existence, but its refusal to become part of the Middle East, to make peace with its Arab neighbors and other issues concerning ethnic tensions in Israel. So I would like to end with a short excerpt from one of my favorite memoirs on the Jewish-Iranian experience in the 1970s by Roya Hakakian. It's called Journey from the Land of No, where she tells about Passover Seder at her family's house in Tehran in 1977. I quote, "Naturally, it caused an uproar at the Seder when father asked Uncle Ardi to read the halachma. Everyone burst into laughter before he even began. He obeyed and read, but not without a touch of subversion, a bit of mischief. This is the bread of affliction, some affliction that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. This year we are slaves, may this slavery never end. This year here and next year at home in Israel, pardon me for not packing. The family dreamed of the land of milk and honey, but wanted to wake up in Tehran. After reciting the halachma, Uncle Ardi asked, so Hakakian, are your bags packed or is the flight to Jerusalem postponed for another year? Father smiled and waved him away, assuming that his question had been meant in jest, but Uncle Ardi, without the slightest hint at humor, pressed on, really Hakakian, why say it? Why not leave it at love thy neighbor like thyself and call off the rest? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have one question so far, and excuse, this is my first time doing this, so please keep on bringing some more questions. So the first question, we have two now, by the same person, Jim Bunton. He asks, were you able to do research for your book in Iran? And can you explain the current status of the Jewish community in Iran?
So I, as an Israeli, I couldn't visit Iran. I couldn't go to conduct my research in Iran, but luckily, just as I'm able to speak at Sternfeld right now from Pennsylvania, I was able to hire research assistants in Tehran that went to the archives for me. Friends who visited Iran looked for sources for me, and I interviewed people, Iranian Jews, on Skype, in Israel, in the US. So I can guess that had I had the opportunity to go by myself, I might be able to get access to different sources, but that's what I could work with. So yeah. And the question, the status of the Jewish community in Iran today, this is a difficult question to answer. It's not easy to be a Jew in Iran, in the Islamic Republic today. Having said that, it's not easy to be an Iranian in the Islamic Republic today, regardless of religion. So there are things that have been made worse for the Jews. There are things that are not, but the thing is that, all right, so they keep their representation in the Majlis, but they are not, there are many barriers to their social assimilation. Religious institutions, Jewish religious institutions enjoy greater participation than even before the revolution, because now the state sponsoring the religious institutions. So, I mean, I used to joke that there are more kosher restaurants in Tehran than there are in Austin, Texas, which was where I got my PhD. So, I mean, the situation of the Jews in Iran today is complicated, but something that we have to remember is that they are not stuck in Iran. They are not, we are not talking about situation of, you know, not without my daughter, that they are locked and cannot escape Iran. They can leave Iran. They travel to the US, they travel to Israel, and they go back to Iran. And they go back to Iran because it's their choice. And they have many reasons. I mean, when we talk with them, when we ask them, they have many reasons why they want to stay in Iran, even in those inconvenient times. So that's my probably not most coherent response, but this is what I can say about the situation of the Jews in Iran today.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have a few more questions and some I think that are still coming in. So first of all, Aaron Tapper, who I should thank because he suggested, I believe he suggested that you come and speak. So he says, excellent talk, thank you very much. Can you speak to the various strains of Zionist and anti-Zionist thought in the various Jewish-Iranian communities in Israel, Iran, and Los Angeles, perhaps in broad strokes and specifics?
So Aaron, thank you so much for everything that you have done for this event to happen. Zionist thought, and I would say anti-Zionist thought, is also part of the Zionist discourse in Iran, is very important. There is no, so in Iran, as I mentioned in my talk, there were few stages for the development of Zionist discourse. One was, yes, it's great, we should join it. The second was, yes, it's great, but for other Jews who cannot stay in Iran, in their homeland, not in Iran. Then for about 25% of the Jewish community between 48 and 51, it was, Zionism was redemption in many ways, because it was either from religious motivations or political motivations, even social economic motivations, because many of the poorest Iranian Jews immigrated to Israel and then were able to elevate their status. And in fact, some of them even returned to Iran as employees of Israeli companies and were able to reintegrate into the upper middle class in Iran when they came with their Israeli employer. So their perspective on Zionism changed. What we see in Israel and the US is quite fascinating. First of all, in Israel, we see the Iranian community, and I'm going to make it too simplified, and I'm going to make some terrible generalizations, but because of time, and I'm happy to talk with you and everyone about it in later. Iranian Jews are considered part of the Mizrahi ethnic group. And this is a category that actually became a category only in Israel after 1948. As Mizrahis, or as like other Mizrahi groups, they became very, sociologically, they became very supportive of the national camp, what is called the right wing in Israel. And they are part of the right wing bloc in Israel. And so they adopted a more nationalistic, militaristic view of Zionism. However, when in 2012, when Netanyahu was trying to gather the international coalition against Iran, and everybody was talking about should Israel bomb Iran? Is it going to escalate into a military conflict? CNN went to sent their reporter in Israel to Little Tehran in Tel Aviv. And they asked people, what do they think? And they went into Persian restaurants that still have the portrait of the Shah and the flag of, and the Pahlavi flag behind them. And they asked them, should Israel bomb Iran? And the response was overwhelmingly no. and some of the interviewees, I remember saying that it's like choosing between mother and father. They can't, like Israel and Iran are in bad terms right now, but we shouldn't have to choose between mother and father. And I think that this is very interesting, you know, when we look at them as part of the Mizrahi group that usually is attributed with the more hawkish views. And in Iran and in the US, the Iranian Jewish community is, I'd say, had a different process of socialization. It's a relatively new community. I mean, it's really becoming a community after 1979, or a massive community after 1979. And the way that they were introduced into the American society was when in the background, there was the revolution, the hostage crisis, and their need to show that they are not as the bad guys on television. So they adopted much more hawkish stances. Even people who were active in the Tudeh party and the revolutionary movement in 1979, 1981, when they came to the US, they became super like American patriots, super supportive of like Zionism and Israel's defenders of Israel by all means. And this is something that actually I'm looking at right now for my next book project. So I'll have more to say about it in the future.
So actually, I think you touched upon this just now, but Aaron had a follow-up, and he says that in the Jewish-Iranian communities in Los Angeles, I have a number of experiences with, quote, loud and proud Zionists among those born circa 1977 to 1979 and thereafter, so those born in Iran and the US. Have you noticed any generational shifts vis-a-vis Zionist belief and thought across the Jewish-Iranian generations in LA?
Again, it's fascinating, and I'm now starting to see or to characterize the different streams of the American Jewish of the Iranian Jewish community in LA. But there certainly there is the mainstream, which is much more, how should I answer it and stay? All right. When you look on voting patterns in Los Angeles County, you see that Westwood is a red dot and it's growing in the 80s. You see Beverly Hills, that is a red dot, and it's growing in the 80s and 90s. And it reflects something about the community, about the way that it positioned itself vis-a-vis the American society and the Jewish community, in the American Jewish community. And there is generational shift, but it goes to many directions. Some of them look for different explanation for the immigration story of their parents or grandparents. Some of them look for explanation for what happened with the Iranian Jewish community in the 20th century. And some of them are not satisfied with the attempt to combine the European Ashkenazi historical experience and the Mizrahi Iranian Jewish experience of the 20th century. And it goes to many directions. Some of it is also connected to how many of them are interacting with non-Jewish Iranians. So if they go to places or if they're friends with non-Jewish Iranians, they get different perspectives. But again, I will have more to say about it in few months.
Okay, great. So I'll move on to one of the next questions, and there are several more. So I should have mentioned at the beginning, I don't know that we'll be able to get to all of these questions. So this is from Babak Adibi. He says, great talk. The Tudeh party involvement was a great insight. Can you also expand on involvement and contributions of Iranian Jewish intellectuals and industrialists during the Shah's period and now?
Can you repeat? You were cutting off.
Oh, sorry. So he says that he asks, can you expand on the involvement and contributions of Iranian Jewish intellectuals and industrialists during the Shah's time and now?
So Iranian Jewish intellectuals and industrialists, I mean, this is really a topic for another talk. Iranian Jews were overrepresented in every field of the Iranian public sphere in the 1950s through, not 50s, actually from the 60s onwards. There is a great statistic that Jews were 2 of the 18 members of the Royal Academy were Jews. 6% of the medical doctors of Iran were Jewish, and in the cities, it sometimes got to almost 20%. And I remind you that the Jewish population was about 0.5% of the population throughout the 20th century. Intellectuals, there are Jewish thinkers that had become leaders of the Communist Party. For example, oh, now I'm blanking on his name. I mentioned it in my book. He wrote the memorial book of the communist martyrs of Iran, and he introduced, as far as we know, he introduced the term shahid for a political martyr. And it's ironic that a Jewish thinker used religious terminology to describe political martyrs, but Rahim Namvar, that's his name. And he was one of the most important thinkers of the Iranian left in the 60s and 70s. There were Jewish entrepreneurs in the entertainment industry. Harun Yeshaya, for example, who is now still considered one of the leaders of the Jewish community, had actually won Life Achievement Award from the Iranian Film Society for his long and rich career in producing films that were blockbusters. So, and in terms of industry, there was Habib al-Qanyan, who was executed in 1979, but he was one of the most important industrialists in Iran in the Pahlavi period. He established Plasco, which is a plastic company that only a couple of years ago, the building that was one of the first malls in Iran that was called the Plasco building was burned down. And it was, people responded to it that it's actually quite symbolic that that this building that was built by this industrialist, this philanthropist, Jewish, and was so visible, had now gone. And so, I mean, Jews were overrepresented in many fields, and they were very visible before 1979. Obviously, It changed after 1979, and today what we see, what we hear, is the Jewish representative in the Majlis that can become more or less vocal depending on the political situation and their confidence. And there is the Jewish publication that goes from Jewish newspaper. There are a few Jewish newspapers, but the official big one is Ofek Bina, and it's been running since 1999 until today. And I mean, it's a venue for Jewish intellectuals in Iran today to engage in some kind of intellectual conversation with the Jewish community.
Okay, great. Another question is from Michael Jaffe. He says, thank you. Can you briefly draw any conclusions from the comparisons of the Golden Age narrative of Iranian Jewry versus the Golden Age narrative of Jews in the United States?
I tend to be very skeptic about narratives of Golden Age. People who live in these golden ages don't know that they live in golden ages. And there's a reason for that. So, you know, in my book, I talk about the Jews in the Revolution, and I talk about the involvement of the Jews in the Revolution. And the title of this chapter is Unintended Consequences. And this goes exactly to describe the Golden Age and the response to the Golden Age. Because people thought that under the Pahlavi, there was this Golden Age of Jews and religious minorities. I mean, people who called it Golden Age usually did not look at the Baha'is and ask them if they had any Golden Age in this minorities' Golden Age. But also it misses the point that because of many social and cultural transformations, Jews no longer saw themselves exclusively as Jewish Iranians. They thought of themselves as Iranian citizens, as Iranian subjects, as members of the Iranian society, and their worldview included many more aspects than just the situation of the Jewish community or Jewish institutions in this period. So what I suggest is not to fall into the trap of explanations like Golden Age or framing of Golden Age, and see what does it mean to which community. Certainly, the situation of Jews in Tehran was different from the Jews of Hamadan or Shiraz or Yazd or Lorestan or other places. So we have to be more specific and also to realize that at least in the better part of the 20th century, the Jewish community of Iran was not just a Jewish community, it was Jewish communities.
Okay, great. Another question regards military service. So are Jews required to serve in the Iranian military? I know you've written about this in the historical perspective, but it seems like the person asking the question wants to know whether that's still the case.
Of the military service?
Of military service, yes.
So Jews have been serving in the military. Some of them got to become officers. It was in the Pahlavi period, Jews could become pretty high rank officers. There was a limit, however, on how far they can go in their military career. In the Iran-Iraq war, there were few Jewish pilots in the Iranian Air Force, and there were many Jews that actually were sent to the front line and died for the country. There's in December 2014, the Iranian government unveiled a monument commemorating the Jewish fallen soldiers in the Iran-Iraq war. So this was a way to recognize their contribution, but also to allow the Jewish community to become part of the national story of the Iran-Iraq war. So I don't know if I can say that today military service is something that Iranian Jews look forward to. Many try to pay an amount that it's a fine that releases them from military duty. Some of them choose to go as a way to show that they are in fact part of the Iranian society, and so I mean the military service is open for them, and it is perceived in some circles as ways of being part of the Iranian society.
Great, so we have time for one more question, and that comes from Zachary Baker. So he says, you mentioned that you interviewed the former president, Bani Sadr. What types of questions were you asking, and what were his responses? Did you interview other former officials of the Islamic Republic?
So the interview with Bani Sadr was fascinating because for my research, he was relevant in more than one occasion. One of the things that were most interesting for me was that he was sent to Israel as a leader of student delegation in the 1960s. And I wanted to know how this experience shaped his views on Israel, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what of that did he take with him? And this was fantastic conversation that we had. And I asked him about the position of the Jews in the transition between the Pahlavi period and the Islamic Republic. And he shared with me something that I was able to later find evidence for in other sources, that in the Constitutional Drafting Committee, there was a Jewish member, Aziz Daneshrad, who was one of the Jewish leaders, a very prominent leader in the Jewish community, and he was one of the leaders of the Tudeh party. And Daneshrad offered in one of the meetings that the reserved seat for the religious minorities should be repealed, should be abolished, and minorities will be able to compete on the national list in the political parties. And Bani Sadr told him that he is crazy. If the religious minorities would give up their reserved seat, they will not be represented, and there's no way that even in the most optimistic scenario, Jews will be able to compete on the national list in Iranian politics. Of course, that the conversation was much more he elaborated on his answers, and it was very interesting. And you know, the political career of Bani Sadr was cut short because he was in different position regarding many things with the new leadership. So.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand it over to Charlotta, but I wanted to say thank you so much. This was a fantastic talk, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you over here in person.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much, Lior. In the real world, we would now have a book sale in the bookstore in the background of the room to sell the book, and people could hang out a little bit more for a more direct interactions with you and follow-up Q&A, but maybe the questions that we couldn't get to through this format, they can email you. And we hope that everyone will have a chance or find a way to read the book. I don't want to advertise from whom to buy it right now, because then you end up supporting the evil empires.
No,
but
Stanford University Press.
Go directly to Stanford University Press. That's right. Always a great partner. This was so fabulous. And we will figure out a way after we make it back into the real world to bring you back to campus, because this was fabulous. And Daniela, also thank you so much for helping with moderating. It's not easy. So thank you everyone, also the participants. And we will hopefully see you in a different venue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.